The year is 2017, and you learn that an 18-year-old boy just shot a campaign for Burberry. You think to yourself, wow, this kid must be insanely talented to land such a gig. Then you learn that this kid was David Beckham's son. Then later, you find out he's releasing his debut book with the unbelievably unoriginal title of What I See. Your blood starts to boil, the room starts to spin, you think nothing in this world is real and that the system is rigged, and you spiral out of control until one day, the only thing keeping you sane is your cat and your 50 houseplants you struggle to keep alive every day, because no matter how hard you try to make it as a photographer, there's always going to be a nepo baby who will just get to skip the queue. Do you remember 2017? It was a simpler time. Relatively. Simpler is a relative term. However, the photography world was split when a young teenage Brooklyn Beckham released his photo book. Some people said it was decent, whilst arguably the lasting impression was that it was terrible, amateur, and just pretty bad. But for some reason, even though it's been years since that book came out, I always think about it, and I think about this incredible picture of an elephant. I like to argue that it isn't necessarily a bad photo, it's just misplaced. And before you go into the comments and start rage typing that Brooklyn Beckham is a pathetic amateur imposter who never should have got the opportunities he got, I just want to first point out some of the actually decent photos that I think are decent in this book. And if you're thinking I spent $50 on this book, of course I didn't. There was 300 images in this book, so some of them had to be decent. Now, why do I think that these bad photos aren't actually that bad, but rather just misplaced? And the reason why I think that, there's a legendary photographer who I would argue is pretty terrible at taking photos, or at least he chooses to be aimless and messy when taking his photos. He takes photos in a way I can only describe as completely random and unpredictable. Having said that, he is without a doubt one of the modern greats of street photography. I'm of course talking about Daido Moriyama. Daido Moriyama is 85 years old and has a literal lifetime of experience and expertise. However, if you were to see him out in the wild doing his thing, you would probably think he had no idea how to use a camera, because he'll do things that are just wild. Over and over again, Moriyama pauses in his tracks and just stands there, pressing the shutter button of his camera. Looking around continually alert, he points the lens towards whatever catches his interest. Occasionally he holds his camera at chest height and just presses the shutter button, keeping it pressed down, taking one shot after another in quick succession. Gazing into the viewfinder of his camera, he just stands there, stock still, like a character in a film that's been paused. What am I waiting for? Well, nothing in particular. This thought process is it's just all over the place. It doesn't make any sense. There's no consistency to it. I've seen clips of him sticking his arm around a corner and just start snapping blindly without even looking. He's famous for not looking through the viewfinder when taking photos. Can you imagine shooting film without looking through the viewfinder? I think setting my money on fire would literally be less wasteful. On the one hand, you have photographers who literally meditate to the mantra of shooting with intentionality and making every click count. And then on the other hand, you've got Daido doing whatever the hell this is. Personally, the reason why I admire him so much is because of his ability not to take a good photo, because you know what, I'm sure he knows how to take a beautifully composed photo with tack sharpness and pretty colors, perfect depth of field, all that. Of course he knows how to do that. I admire his work for how it makes you feel, and makes you feel like you're seeing a completely different world. And that is something that's very rare. If you look at one of his photos, if you look at his photos individually, they are arguably pretty terrible and not very pleasing to the eye. But when you experience his photos as a mass of photos, which I assume is how he wants them to be experienced, these random, chaotic, blurry, messy photos that seem to have no rhyme or reason to them suddenly start to make sense. A few months ago, Leah and I went to the photographer's gallery to see Dido's exhibition, and it was quite interesting because his work was literally plastered on the walls, just in a grid fashion, like thousands of his images. And there were hundreds of these photos, hundreds of these black just blurs that were kind of in a city urban sort of setting. You could just about make that it was in a city, and you know, individually you would never show them to a art collector. They would probably laugh at you. You know, you want to sell this piece of shit? Like, what, get the hell out of here. But if you intertwine these photos with the rest of his similar images of shadowy figures, of just weird things that he sees in the city, you suddenly feel like you're in an alternate reality, but you also get the feeling of what it's like to be Dido himself. And that is an odd feeling. After the exhibition, I felt like I had popped the lid off his head and I was looking directly into his skull. You know, for the longest time I didn't understand the appeal of these blurry, grainy photos, like that could have literally been taken by a baby. But after his exhibition, it kind of made sense. Now I want to tell you guys a story that I've literally never told anyone. Okay, this is a YouTube exclusive. So this is my bachelor's degree in German literature. This took 4 years of my life to do, and never more so in my life did I feel like I didn't have a clue what was going on. And in my final year, I did a module called Debating Enlightenment, and it was tough. We literally had to read a book every single week, and I think 3 times in that term, we had to write a 2,000-word essay. And the lecturer was an absolute hard ass. Like, she would have a go at you in front of the whole class if you didn't have anything to say. Usually teachers will tell you off if you speak in class. This one did the complete opposite. And aside from that, there was one instance that has shaped me as a person. Well, rather, shaped me as an artist, maybe. And it's been burnt into me. It burnt into my core being. So one time after I wrote one of these essays, I felt like, you know, when I handed in the essay, I felt like I felt like I had actually done all right. I thought it was actually pretty decent. But then I got my essay back and I read the feedback from her, and it was brutal. Like, she completely destroyed me. Well, she destroyed my work. All over the page, I just remember the word vague. She wrote it at least 20 times. It was crazy. And I was tearing my hair out. I didn't understand what she meant by vague. This was a 2,000-word essay. How could I have been vague? I wrote 2,000 words. I thought it was really ironic that she called my essay vague when the only piece of feedback she gave me was the word vague. However, over 10 years has passed, and I finally understand what she meant by that. You see, that essay was a very low-level piece of writing. And having read many, many books since, I realized that the best books that I've enjoyed have been the ones that pick one topic, one concept, one hypothesis, and just gone really, really deep into it. And you know, the author will investigate and contradict themselves and challenge themselves from every which angle. And on the other hand, my essay was saying a million different things. I was picking too many things to focus on. And I was never really going in depth in any of them. So how does this relate to photography and Brooklyn Beckham's book? Brooklyn Beckham's book. And I've learned that one of the key components of a great photographer is the photographer's ability to provide a deep and meaningful insight through photos, regardless of what the subject is. You see, Dido doesn't bother trying to be technically perfect, but rather he strives to dig as deeply as possible into whatever feeling or desire he's trying to evoke. The way I like to think of it is that each of his photos is a statement or a single word. And he repeats that word or that statement over and over and over again to the point that his photos create a language of its own. Even though you and I can't speak a single word of it, once you see enough of his photos, you start to feel it and you start to kind of understand it. And I think that's one of the greatest obstacles photographers face when they want to create great work. It's not necessarily the technical requirements or having the eye or financial constraints. It's the desire, the willingness to commit oneself to a single topic. Because it's a scary thing to do. Most of us will say, oh, I don't know what to photograph. That's a lie. I know you know what you want to photograph. And I think that's very silly, especially when you consider another photography great, Joel Meyerowitz. So imagine you're in the 70s and you're good friends with Joel, and Joel comes up to you and he tells you about his next project. He tells you that he's going to shoot red-haired people in Cape Cod because he loves how the color of their red hair contrasts the blueness of Cape Cod. At this point, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Joe is a complete and utter weirdo, because on the face of it, taking pictures of red-haired people because you like the color against the, like, it's such an obscure, abstract thing. Like, only a complete weirdo would want, like, what? I mean, cool. And yeah, it sounds weird, but he did it anyway. The result is that, yeah, it's actually kind of cool. Or another one of his seminal works is his series of swimming pool images. It's literally just pictures of swimming pools. My point is that whatever you have to say doesn't have to be profound or mind-blowing or groundbreaking. It doesn't even have to make sense or be obvious. For example, look at these books from Gregory Crewdson and Maria Lax.
So let me show you two perfect examples of what I mean about the message doesn't even have to be obvious. It just has to be consistent. Look at these images by Gregory Crewdson. They are like dramatic, somatic, detailed, emotional, but there isn't anything clear about it. Or this book by Maria Lax. This one as well is abstract, it's colourful, it's moody, it's mysterious. It's just beautiful, but they're all consistent.
Like, I can't tell you what they're trying to say here. The point is that whatever you say, make sure you say it in an exhaustive, comprehensive manner. Say it as many times as you possibly can, from every angle, from every perspective that you can think of. By doing so, something quite remarkable happens. You create a body of work, and when someone sees that body of work, and if that body of work is robust enough and in-depth enough, then the viewer, whoever sees it, will have no choice but to come away with something. It becomes impossible for the viewer to not come away with something. People often say things like, what does this art even mean? What does it even mean? What am I looking at? And it sort of leaves a lot of people frustrated. And I think that's like a false expectation of art. You know, of course, art can be a device to bring awareness to an important issue. I think art doesn't have to mean anything, but why I think art is important regardless is that it has an ability to remove the viewer from their own perspective and into someone else's, or into a different one altogether, even if it is for just a brief second. So the issue with Brooklyn Beckham's book is that he should have just picked one thing to say. He could have chosen portraits of his family, portraits of strangers, African wildlife, or dinner parties, and then just said that 1,000 times over. He didn't have to worry about the image looking perfect or technically sound. It could have been blurry, blown out of focus, poorly composed, because photographers like Dido do exactly that. And they prove that great photography doesn't require being a great photographer at all. So to use my university lecturer's words, Brooklyn's book wasn't that bad at all. It was just a bit too vague.